I do agree with the statement that that forcing your dietary choices onto other people is a form of it's a colonial mindset. I do have to question why it only applies to veganism. Why doesn't it apply to the food system at large? So if I want to dissect that a little bit, and basically, when Europeans came to the Americas, they thought mistakenly that the foods here were not good for them, that they would die out of like malnourishment and so on. In a very hilarious take, um, their measure of how malnourished somebody was that indigenous people couldn't grow facial hair, and they thought that they were going to lose their facial hair, and that meant that they were going to die. But that was not true. So starting with Columbus' second trip to the Americas, they started bringing animals uh, over. And today, the three species we consume the most, like cows, pigs, and chickens, they were all brought from Europe here, and they didn't exist here. Chickens are questionable. There's research about that, but the chickens that we people eat were brought from Europe. Um, so the food system that is centered in animal agriculture is built on settler colonialism. Uh, why uh, that doesn't apply? That only applies when we're talking about veganism. I really don't know. So I really and me as a person from South America, I really cringe when I hear people say like, "Hey, these vegans cannot take my carne asada away." I'm like, well, your carne asada was not really. It's not just the body of a dead animal, but it was never yours to begin with. Like, it's European food. Um, Furthermore, Europeans also banned growing native foods because they thought it was, as they used to call it, food for Indians. So the most prominent example of that is quinoa. Quinoa was banned; it was illegal to grow. Uh, and today we eat quinoa because somebody said, "Well, screw these guys. We're gonna just grow it somewhere," and they couldn't. I tell people every time you eat quinoa, you're really eating indigenous resistance because if no, if they had complied, that food would have been gone. It's very ironic and kind of sad that now the left brings it full circle, and now quinoa, foods like quinoa, are now white foods and privileged foods. Um, so finally, I want to say that what you were talking about, the history of cattle ranching in the Americas is just violent. Um, so it all started with there was something called the doctrine of discovery, and the doctrine of discovery was basically a blank moral check that the Vatican gave the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns uh, to come here and do whatever they wanted, because in their view they were spreading Christianity. So it was all good. Like in the eyes of God, they were not committing any sins. Um, when it comes to land itself, the doctrine of discovery put forward the idea that the lands in the Americas were nobody's land, in Spanish, tierra de nadie, and they was up for grabs because those lands were not property of Christians. So any new lands that were discovered became the property of the expedition that discovered them and the Spanish crown. Uh, Over time, that led to huge swaths of land being owned by very few people. And today, so 500 years later, uh, Central and South America have the worst land ownership distribution in the world, and Colombia being probably the worst offender when it comes to that. And it's one of the main causes of poverty in in the countryside. And I should also mention that most of this land, agricultural land in Central South America, is used for cattle ranching, and that cattle all that industry would not exist, or wouldn't be possible without the extermination of the indigenous population and the clearing of all these ecosystems, which, newsflash, they also include animals.